delighted to welcome today Dr. Sean Reardon, who's Professor of Education and Sociology at Stanford. In his research, Professor Reardon investigates the causes, patterns, and consequences of social and educational inequality. In particular, he studies issues of residential and school segregation, and of racial and ethnic and socioeconomic disparities in academic achievement and educational success. His work also involves developing methods of measuring social and educational inequality, including the measurement of segregation and achievement gaps, and methods of causal inference in educational and social science research. He teaches grad courses in applied statistical methods with a particular emphasis on applying experimental and quasi-experimental methods to the investigation of issues of educational policy and practice. He received his doctorate in education from Harvard. He has had a number of awards, including the William T. Grant Foundation Scholar Award, the Carnegie, and the National Academy of Education Postdoctoral Fellowship. I suppose the reason I am introducing him is that a lot of my research focuses on similar things, and so we've begun having a great conversation. We're delighted to welcome him. Please give him a round of applause.
Freeman, thanks for that warm welcome, and thanks to Marv and Claudia for initiating the invitation to me here. It's always a pleasure to come to a place I haven't been and meet a bunch of new people and tell you a little bit about the work I've been doing. So what I want to talk about, I don't need this mic, right? I'm good, right? You can hear me? What I want to talk about is some recent work I've been doing about the relationship between income inequality, and educational outcomes, drawing on a range of different studies and evidence. And I want to start by sort of giving you 6 sort of stylized facts, sort of descriptive facts about the sort of recent history of income and education in the US. So first fact is the story of income inequality in the US. And so income inequality has grown a great deal recently in the US. If you look at this picture, this is one picture of the trend in income inequality in the US over the last century. Starting in 1918, it's ironic, I've had this picture for a while, but I was struck by the fact that we have income inequality is higher than it was in 1918, but the number of horses and bayonets in the military is actually a lot smaller than it was in 1918, I learned the other day. So whether there's a relationship, I don't know. But this graph tells you that how many, what share of all the income earned in the US goes to the top 10% of earners. And you can see that back in the 1920s and 1930s, income inequality was high. The top 10% of earners were earning 45, almost 50% of all the income in the US. The economy changed dramatically with World War II. We entered a period of rapid economic growth in the 50s and 60s and relatively low income inequality. And that started to grow again starting in the late 70s and early 80s. And now the most recent data suggest that the top 10% of earners are again earning close to 50% of all the income in the US. This last data point is 2010, but if you looked at the 2011 and I'm sure the 2012 data, I think it's going up because the top earners have made so much in the stock market and investments in the last few years, while the middle class and poor's incomes have been basically stagnant. So we're in a period of historically really high income inequality in the US. And one of the stories you hear about income inequality, which is true, is that most of the growth in income inequality has been at the high end. That is not just the 1%, but the 1/100th of a percent, the 1/1000th of a top percent have grown. And that's true if you look at all earners. But what's important when we're thinking about education is what's happened to the income inequality among families with school-aged children, because of course it's families with children for whom the income inequality matters the most when we're thinking about educational outcomes. And this shows you the income inequality trend over the last 40 years or so among those families with school-aged children. And the measure of income inequality here is slightly different. This is the ratio of the income of a family at the 90th percentile of the income distribution to a family at the 10th. So it's sort of how much more does a high-income family earn from a low-income family. In 1970, that was about 5 times as much. So maybe a ratio of $100,000 to $20,000 income in current dollars. And that grew a lot in the 70s and 80s and early 90s and has been growing again lately, so that now the high-income family earns about 11 times as much as the low-income family. So the 90th percentile family now makes about $170,000. A 10th percentile family makes about $16,000. So the disparity in incomes among the families of school-age children has grown dramatically. And most of that growth, this is the same thing, but now we're looking at the growth in the ratio of the income of the 50th percentile to the 10th percentile family, that is sort of the middle-class family to the poor family, or the 90th to the 50th, that's the rich family to the middle-class family. And you can see that most of the growth that happened in the 70s and 80s was because the incomes of the middle class and the poor diverged a lot. And the incomes of the rich relative to the middle class have sort of grown steadily over that time period, but not quite as dramatically. And so keep this in mind a little bit later when we think about how achievement patterns have changed, because the relationship between achievement to income has changed over this time as well. So the first thing to keep in mind is how income inequality has changed over the last few decades. Second point I want to make is that the income achievement gap has grown while the black-white gap has narrowed. So that in the last 2 decades, there's been a lot of attention in the US, a lot of well-deserved attention to racial achievement gaps, particularly the black-white achievement gap. And the No Child Left Behind legislation sort of actually mandates that states and schools pay attention to the black-white achievement gap. So attention to the black-white gap has been sort of written into law in the last decade. But we haven't paid as much attention to the achievement gap between high and low income students. And so I did a study a year or 2 ago trying to look at what's happened to the achievement gap between high and low income students. And first, let me just tell you how we measure achievement gaps between high and low income students. To measure achievement gaps between black and white students, we just take the average test score of black students and the average test score of white students and subtract them. And we look and see if that gap has gotten bigger over time. But income, there's not two groups of people. Income varies. So what we do is I have a lot of studies that we pulled together over for the last 50 years, and we look at people's rank in the income distribution. And then we look at the average test scores of people at different ranks. We draw this line, and then we say, if you're at the 90th percentile, what's the average income of a student, or the average test score of a student whose family's at that percentile? We do it at the 10th percentile, and then we're going to take this difference. So what we're looking at here is the gap between sort of the average student right around the 90th percentile and the average student right around the 10th percentile. And if the gap's getting bigger over time, that means this line's getting steeper. The relationship between income and achievement is getting steeper. And if the gap's getting smaller, it means this is getting flatter. And so I pulled together a bunch of studies spanning the last 50 years, and I sort of made pictures like this for every one of them. Compute this gap. Now, this gap is measured in standard deviation units, and I'll talk in a minute about what those mean. But it's a way of standardizing the size of the gap when you have different tests and things like that. And so we measure this gap from each of them, and then I put them all together into a big messy picture like this. So each of the colors is from a different study. Each of the studies pertains to cohorts of children born in different years. The earliest study that we have, these are all big nationally representative studies, so tens of thousands of students in each of these studies from all over the country. The earliest is a study that was done in 1960 that has 400,000 high school students were tested in 1960 on a standardized test. So those are kids born in the early 40s. And then there's a bunch of these other studies, and for each of them, the height of the dot represent how big the gap is, and the bars on it are sort of our error bars. So I'm going to show you the picture. This is for reading, and this is for math. You can see that both for reading and math, we see the same sort of trend. The gaps were pretty flat for kids born in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then started to go up sometime for cohorts of kids born in the mid-70s until 2000 or so, pretty sizably. And I'll show you the picture this way from now on. We'll take away all the dots and the bars and just look at the line. So this is the same line as before, so this is the sort of stylized fact about the trends in the income achievement gap. It was a about 0.8 standard deviations in the 60s and 70s, and now it's about 1.25 standard deviation. So it's gone up by about 40 to 50% over the last several decades. So that's a pretty sizable increase. I'll talk in a second about how you should think about how big a standard deviation unit is. Not even just a second, right now. So how big is a standard deviation unit? So one way to think about it, it's the difference between a student at the 31st and the 69th percentile. So when we say that the gap is 1.25 standard deviations, that means the average low-income student at the 10th percentile has scores somewhere around the 25th percentile of the distribution, and the average high-income student has scores somewhere around the 75th percentile of the income distribution. So those are pretty large differences. Another way of saying it is that the average student at the 10th percentile of the income distribution has scores lower than 84% of the students in families at the high end. That's if the gap were 1 standard deviation. It's actually worse than that because it's 1.25 standard deviation. So a standard deviation is a big difference. So to say the gap is now 1.25 standard deviations is to say it's quite large. Another way of thinking about it is how long does it take you to learn a sort of standard deviation worth of learning? Kids learn very fast in kindergarten, so it takes them about a year. By middle school, it takes about 3 years to move up a standard deviation. By high school, you learn less than a standard deviation. The average student gains less than a standard deviation all the way through high school. So to say that students are 1.25 standard deviations behind is to say they're somewhere like 5 years behind by the time they're in high school. Right? So these are, you should worry a lot about the magnitude of these gaps, and the fact that they're getting bigger is not trivial. I'm also going to now compare this. This is our red line, the income gap. This dashed line is the black-white test score gap over the same time period. And so the great news historically is that we made lots of progress as a country in closing that black-white gap for kids born in the 60s, 70s, and into the sort of mid-70s. That is, the gap was 1.25 standard deviation for kids born in the 50s, less than 3/4 of a standard deviation now. Lots of progress made. The reasons we made that progress have to do not just with schooling policy like desegregation of schools in the South, but also health policy. The desegregation of hospitals in the South had a huge effect on black infant mortality and black infant health, which then had big effects on the educational success of black children in the South. Housing discrimination was reduced. Labor market discrimination was reduced. Incomes of black families grew. All of those things contributed to the decline of the black-white gap in the for kids born in the 50s and 60s. But then progress kind of stopped, and we haven't made much progress since then. So the black-white gap is still quite large, 3/4 of a standard deviation, and not closing very fast in the most recent data we have. So we should still worry a lot about the black-white gap. But another way to think about this picture is to think about this as the story of late 20th century America, right? In the 50s and 60s, the US was characterized by historically low levels of economic inequality. As I showed you on that first graph, income inequality was low in the 50s and 60s, but historically very high levels of racial inequality. School segregation, housing segregation, labor market discrimination, hospital segregation, violence against blacks, all sorts of forms of racial inequality were very strong in the US in the 50s and 60s, and that pattern is sort of mirrored in the gaps. The black-white gap is bigger than the income gap in that time period. But we now live in an era where economic inequality is historically as high as it's ever been and going up, and racial inequality is far from zero in the US, but it's lower than it has been historically. There's less school segregation than there's used to be. There's less residential segregation than there used to be. There's more parity in the labor market between blacks and whites than there used to be. Black-white graduation rate gap is smaller than it used to be. Black-white health differences aren't as big as they used to be. So we're still very, very far away from racial parity, and you can see that because the gap is quite big. But we've in some ways moved from a society where racial inequality dominates economic inequality to one where, in some sense, economic inequality dominates racial inequality. Now, of course, if you're African American, you're disproportionately likely to be poor. So you kind of get the double whammy here, because there's still racial disparities and there's also these growing economic disparities. So I always have to remind people that I'm not trying to say racial disparities have gone away and we shouldn't think about them, but rather to call attention to this widening economic disparity that's happening at the same time as we have these sort of continuing racial disparities, which adds a sort of extra, a compounding set of problems to the issue. So this is just to show you what's happened to the black-white achievement gap in recent years. It's still going down, but it's going down very slowly. It'll take about 80 years for it to disappear at this rate. So we're not making enormously rapid progress. I also want to show you what this income achievement gap looks like in the US compared to other countries. So we got data from 19 OECD countries, wealthy, developed OECD countries, and we computed the size of this income achievement gap in all those countries. And this is one study called PEARLS, which tested fourth graders in all these countries in 2001. And among all the countries that we have data for, the US has the largest income achievement gap. In some countries, particularly the Scandinavian countries, the income achievement gap is less than half as big as it in the US. So there's countries that are much more equal in terms of educational outcomes than the US is. Now, they tend to be equal in lots of other domains too, so it's not surprising perhaps. And then we have these are studies that test 15-year-olds in 2006 and 2009. And again, the US ranks very high on this. So not only are the achievement gaps growing in the US, but they're larger than in most other developed countries. Third point I want to make is that most of the growth in this income achievement gap is at the high end of the income distribution. So if we look at our familiar picture now, we can break this. Remember, this is the difference between the 90th percentile student and the 10th. We can break it into how much is between the 90th percentile student and the median income student, and how much is between the median income student and the 10th percentile student. And this is what we see. The gap between the median income student and the low income student has been roughly the same size for the last 50 years. But it's the gap between the student at the high end of the income distribution and the student at the middle of the income distribution that's grown dramatically. That's responsible for basically all of the growth in the gap over this last 30 years. Which raises, I think, and we can maybe have a little discussion about this later if we have time, it raises an interesting set of policy questions, because what do you do about the rich sort of pulling away from the middle? We have a whole repertoire of ways of thinking about social policy when we're worried about the poor falling behind the middle class. And as a country, we're sort of comfortable thinking about targeted policies that benefit the poor. But this isn't a story where targeted policies for the poor are likely to be exactly the right set of remedies, because the real story is a sort of top pulling away from the middle. And so I think it takes a kind of different way of thinking about the problem that I won't go into now, but is worth, I think, a conversation. I'm not going to show you that. Okay, fourth point I want to make. Not only has the achievement gap grown in relationship to income, but the college enrollment gap has grown. And partly that's because the achievement gap has grown. But when we look at high and low income kids and how often they enroll in college or complete college, we see a couple things. First of all, this is just sort of this is from 2004, but I think it's a useful picture just to think about. So this is a study that took about 20,000 10th graders in 2002. And now we're looking at where are they in 2006. So this is the high school graduating class of 2004. Where are they in 2006? Well, this group of them don't have a high school degree. This group graduated from high school but never went to college. This group enrolled in a 2-year college or a vocational school or a technical school, something less than a 4-year college. And then these folks all enrolled in 4-year colleges of different levels of selectivity. So these are the very most selective colleges, and so on down to the sort of open, broad access colleges. And so the width of these shows how many kids are in there, but the colors show the income distribution of the kids in each of those. So the top sort of quintile of the income distribution is this kind of grayish, bluish, I don't know what color that looks like to you, color. And this gray at the bottom is the low-income kids. And you can see, if you're a low-income student, you have a very low chance of going to one of these most selective colleges. And if you're a high-income kid, you have almost a 60% chance of going to one of, 60% of the kids in these colleges are high income. So there's this very disproportionate pattern of income in relationship, not just to going to college, but what kind of college you go to in terms of its selectivity. And so we wanted to look at how that's changed over time. So one study that Martha Bailey and Sue Donarski at Michigan did looks at two cohorts of kids, one from the mid-60s, one from the early 80s. And the low-income students in the early cohort, about 5% of them went to a four-year college. And in the more recent cohort, about 9% went to. So not a very big increase in college going among low-income students. Among the highest income students, the rate increased from 36% to 54%. So a very big increase in that. So that there's a sort of widening disparity in these are actually the portion completing college, not enrolling in college. And so there's this sort of widening disparity there. We looked also at a little bit more refined way. So we looked at what was your probability of going to one of these very selective colleges, depending on your income. And so we left data from the class of 1982. These are high school graduates in 1982. And you can see that if you were below about the 75th percentile of the income distribution, you had less than a 5% chance of going to one of those very selective colleges. But if your income was above the 75th percentile, you have a really rapidly increasing probability of going to one of those. So income really sort of seems to help you out a lot in terms of access to those. Now, there's a lot of reasons why. One, high-income kids tend to have higher test scores, but also they have a lot more sort of legacy and network and kind of connections that help them in access to those places, too. When we look at the next, the 1992 and the 2004 high school classes, you can see that depending where you were in the income distribution, your probability, high-income kids had a much increased probability in these later cohorts of going to these selective colleges, partly because of this widening achievement gap. So these students' test scores are going up a lot relative to lower and middle income students, and so they're getting admitted more. But maybe there's other things going on that are somewhat less meritocratic as well. So now if you're a 90th or so percentile student, you have a very high chance of going to one of these very elite colleges. I mean, this highly selective category is sort of the 100 or so most selective colleges in the country. And so these are the places where all the Fortune 500 companies send their representatives to hire from. These are the places that connect you to the networks of the people who are likely to be future, politicians and CEOs and things. So there's a whole kind of network value to these, and that seems to be increasingly reserved for students who come from very high income backgrounds. And so that, I think, is cause for considerable concern. The fifth point I want to make is that this income achievement gap is really big when kids enter school, and it doesn't change much during school. So you might say, what's wrong with schools? Maybe schools are getting worse for low-income kids or getting better for high-income kids, and that's why the test scores are diverging. But if that were true, we would expect to see these gaps kind of grow while kids were in school, right? We would expect they might come in with small gaps, but then would diverge because of different schooling experiences. Certainly, rich and poor kids have very different schooling experiences, but that doesn't seem entirely to explain the widening of the gap. If we look at, this is a single study of students, the solid red line, students who were entering kindergarten in 1998 and followed for 9 years until they were in 8th grade. And they were tested periodically along the way. And so we measured how big as the gap is for this cohort of students sort of every step of the way. And you can see it's when they enter kindergarten in 1998, the gap is about 1.1, 1.2 standard deviations. And by the time they're in 8th grade, it's about 1.25 standard deviations. So it hasn't gotten a lot bigger while they were in school. It's very, very big when they enter kindergarten. And we have another study there, that other line, which actually gives the same test to 4th graders and then again to them when they enter kindergarten. And you can see the gap is just as big when they're age 4. This is a group of kids who are in age 4 in about 2005, it's just as big. So the gap seems to be very big even in early childhood, which should make us worry. Now, there is some evidence here. If you think about this, the gap gets smaller, a little bit smaller during the kindergarten year, and then over the summer it gets a little bigger, and then during the first grade year it gets a little bit smaller, and then they stopped giving these tests twice a year, so we can't really tell. There's a nice study from the 1980s that was done in Baltimore that followed a cohort of Baltimore public school students from kindergarten on through 8th grade, and that shows a kind of similar pattern where the low-income students sort of fell behind more in the summer and caught up a little more during the school year. So you get this kind of sawtooth pattern, which suggests maybe schools are actually effective somewhat at narrowing the gap, and it's more the out-of-school time that leads to the widening of gap. I don't think you should conclude that on the basis of, you know, 2 little data points right there on this picture, but in conjunction with the Baltimore study and a few other smaller studies, there's some reason to think that there may be a kind of compensatory effect of schooling, where schools actually are somewhat responsible for narrowing these gaps, which would, I think, be very good news. If we say how much of the gap is between the top and the bottom half of the income distribution as kids progress, it's about equal. It doesn't sort of change much. So it's not like the gap between low and middle income kids is narrowing while the gap between middle and high income kids is widening. Relatively static. This is just, we have a bunch of these longitudinal studies done in different points in time that follow kids sort of through time, and you can basically, all of them are pretty flat. That is, the gaps don't look like they get bigger as kids get older within a cohort. The gaps getting bigger is happening across cohort time, not sort of within kids in kind of developmental time. And so all the studies that follow kids over time seem to suggest relatively stable gaps as kids age, at least after they enter kindergarten. And the last point I want to make in this section of the talk is that you might think, so some people say, well, schools have just gotten worse and kids' test scores are going down for everyone except the high-income kids. And so it's a story of the gap is getting bigger because the kind of middle and the bottom of the test score distribution is just going down because schools are just terrible. And I think it's important to realize that's not the case. So if you look at test scores from NAEP, NAEP is the National Assessment of Education Progress, the nation's report card, as they like to call it. If you look at the nation's report card, they've given the same test in reading and the same test in math to students for 40 years. They give to 9-year-olds, 13-year-olds, and 17-year-olds. And these are on the same scale, so you can sort of compare them. And if you look at this, you'll see the lines go up in some cases or flat at worst. In fact, if you look at the math ones, the average 9-year-old in math now has scores that are about halfway between the average 9 and 13-year-old 35 years ago. That is, the average 9-year-old now knows about as much as the average 11-year-old did in the late 1970s. That's 2 years of progress in 35 years. So that definitely does not suggest that sort of scores are going down for everyone except the rich. In fact, if you sort of looked at this in more detail, you'd see that test scores are kind of going up for everyone. They're going up much more for high-income kids than low-income kids, but they're still going up, particularly in math, for low-income kids over this time period. So this isn't a story of American schools are failing and just getting worse and worse and worse for everyone except the rich. Now, you might argue, well, the world's changed and kids need to know a lot more than they used to, and we're still not where we want to be. That may be true. But it's not that kids know less now than they used to. They know more, particularly in math, but also in reading than they used to. And so same story for 13-year-olds now know about what a 14 or a 15-year-old used to know. And not as much progress for the 17-year-olds, but still some progress. So there's sort of six big stylized facts that I want you to sort of have in your mind right now. Income inequality is growing. The income achievement gap has grown. I've forgotten the other 4 of them already, but I'm sure you remember them. Growing more at the top than the bottom, things like that. I'm sure you could look back at the slides better than I can. So the question now is why? What's been going on that makes this income achievement gap grow up? And so what I want to do is tell you sort of some possible explanations for this, sort of a social history of the last 50 years that might help understand this and might help us think about what should we do about it. I'm not going to end with a big packet of solutions that's going to make you feel really happy and optimistic, but I do think it's sort of important. Think of this as like educational epidemiology. You know, epidemiologists like to go around and figure out where's the problem, where's the disease, who's getting it, how is it spreading. If you can map it out and describe its development and trends, then you can figure out sort of how to intervene in it. So think of this as the first part as the kind of educational epidemiology piece of work. Think of this second part as the trying to understand the processes and mechanisms that produce it. And we'll have to work together going forward to think about the third part, which is the sort of what do we do about it, because I'm not going to have a great set of solutions for you here, though I'll make a few sweepingly vague policy suggestions. All right, so what's driving these trends? So a bunch of possibilities. Let me talk through them one at a time. So is it inequality? Inequality was going up over the same time period that the achievement gap was going up. So we might think, well, if a dollar of income sort of, in a crude sense, buys you a certain amount of achievement, right? Or buys your kid a certain amount of achievement. Well, the rich now have a lot more money relative to the poor. And so they have so maybe that's just why the gap is going up, because of a kind of a mechanical relationship between money that families have, resources they have, and their kids' achievement. As the differences in money goes up, so do the differences in achievement. That would be this sort of mechanical association. But another possibility is that it's not just that the rich have more money relative to the middle class and the poor than they used to, but that money matters differently than it used to. That having money is more important somehow in shaping kids' academics and educational success than it used to be. And so that's what I'm going to think of as a kind of contextual association. So 2 different kinds of stories you might tell. Money matters the same way as it used to, but rich just have more of it, or money matters more than it used to. And so we can do a little fancy statistical analysis to try to tease these apart. I won't bore you with the kind of gory details of it, but I'll show you a few pictures that help to get at. First, I want to just show you the sort of relationship between inequality in a country and the size of their income achievement gap. So this is that same data I showed you before, where we had those 19 different countries. And what we've done is we've made this index of the degree of economic inequality within a country. And so this is sort of a composite measure of things like income inequality, child poverty rates, income segregation between families, things like that are sort of measures of how much economic inequality there is between families. And then this is our achievement gap. And okay, the US is a giant outlier on inequality. That is the first thing you should take away from this. And the second thing is that there's a very strong positive association between them. The countries that have higher inequality tend to have higher income achievement gaps. The countries with lower inequality, lots of them in the Scandinavian countries, tend to have lower income achievement gaps. Now, that doesn't prove that income inequality drives it, but at least suggests that there's a consistent pattern, not just in the US, where we see the 2 trends going the same way, but also sort of cross-nationally, where we see the same sort of pattern that we would expect if that were the case. The next thing we did was we did some statistical models to estimate how much is every sort of dollar of income associated with achievement across all of these studies. And so each of these dots, again, we have our time here, but now the dots are how much achievement changes for a doubling of income. So if you have 2 families, one had twice as much income as the other in 1960, and 2 families, one has twice as much income as the other in 2000, is the average difference in their children's achievement the same across time? Or has that sort of doubling of income, does it sort of matter more? Economists like to talk about doubling of income because because they like to think in sort of logarithmic income terms, and that makes sort of sense for this. So instead of a dollar of income, think of a doubling of income. But basically, each of these dots represents the estimate of how strongly a doubling of income is associated with achievement. And it basically hasn't changed much over time. In fact, it's gone down a little bit. When we look at the income of families in the bottom half of the income distribution. But when we look at families in the top half of the income distribution, the relationship between money, having twice as much income, and kids' achievement has gotten much, much stronger than it used to be. So not only, this suggests that the contextual story is partly true. Not only do the rich have more money than they used to, but money seems to matter, particularly at the high end of the income distribution, more than it used to. So two families kind of both in the upper half of the income distribution that had sort of the same amounts of money in constant dollars, one in 1960 and one today, the difference in their children's achievement is much bigger today than it was then. That's what this is saying. So we have to sort of, it's important to think about this because if it's just mechanical, then it just says, well, the only way to get rid of this maybe is just to reduce income inequality. But if it says it's partly a contextual story, if it's partly a story about income mattering more, then we need to understand how and why does income matter more than it used to, and what might we do about that. So why might income matter more? Well, people might be spending their money differently than they used to. And so when we look at how much families spend on their children, we look at data from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. This is work done by sociologist Sabino Cornrich and reported in this book, Wither Opportunity, by Duncan and Murnane. They look at these consumer expenditure surveys, and for low-income families, the amount that they spend on their children is, of course, less than high-income families do because they have less money to spend. But it hasn't changed terribly dramatically over the last 40 years. When we look at the spending of high-income families, it's gone up quite dramatically over the time, going up by sort of 2.5 times. And so one reason money might matter more is because you might be spending more of it on your kids instead of spending it on other things. Of course, it's easy to spend more on your kids when your income keeps growing, so that's part of the story here. But another thing that's been changing, and part of the reason maybe that families are spending more on their kids, is that the ways that parents think about what they're supposed to do as a parent has changed. So I'll show you a picture in a minute that suggests that how we think about what parents should do has changed a lot over the 20th century. Increasingly, parents, particularly middle and upper income parents, think their job is to focus on the cognitive development of their kids, make sure they get cognitive stimulation, socio-emotional development. There's some evidence, and that LaRoe's work suggests that those parents' views of what their kids are supposed to be doing and what they're supposed to do with their kids differ by class. She argues that middle and upper class families have a sort of model of parenting she calls concerted cultivation. Think of it like this. The parents think their children are orchids. An orchid is a very delicate flower, right? You have to water it with an eyedropper and sort of hover over it to make sure that a leaf doesn't actually fall on it or something, right? I mean, that sort of concerted cultivation model says parents have to nurture and focus on the development of their kids, whereas the other model that LaRoe talks about, which she says is more common among working class families, is this model of that children should be thought of as operating under the accomplishment of natural growth. They just grow. Children are not like orchids, they're like trees. They just grow. You don't hover over the trees in your yard. You know, the sun comes out, the rain comes, they grow. You want to avoid major catastrophe. You don't want to drive a bulldozer into them or something. But basically, you don't have to do a lot with the tree. It will develop on its own. And so these kind of different models of parenting that LaRoe says are sort of somewhat associated with social class may help explain this partly, particularly if this concerted cultivation model has become much more common over the last several decades as parenting views have changed. Also, education policy since the mid-'80s has really focused increasingly on test scores and cognitive development as the thing that schools do. If you went back to the 70s or the 60s or the first half of the 20th century, the progressive era, you would not find people's who were talking about what schools should do focused on test scores. That wasn't, or certainly not only on test scores. Schools were thought of as the way you socialize children. They're how people learn to become members of democracy. They learn to play well together. There's lots of other social goals for schooling than test scores, but because our education policy is increasingly focused on test scores, that gives a signal to parents that says what you should care about is your kids' test scores, and by extension, you ought to care about kids' cognitive development. You ought to focus on how they're going to do on things like tests, not other kinds of outcomes. So one of my favorite studies for thinking about this is this study that Julia Wrigley did back in the late 80s, and I wish somebody would update it. So what she did, she had, how much she did and how much her graduate students did, I don't know, but she and her graduate students looked at thousands of magazine articles from magazines published over the course of the 20th century, up to 85, because that's when they were doing it, from magazines that were focused, that were aimed at mothers. So things like Good Housekeeping or Ladies' Home Journal or Parenting Magazine, whatever the analogs to those would have been in other eras. And she looked for articles in which there was advice given to parents about what to do with young children. And she coded the advice into 5 types of advice. So the advice was either about nutrition, feed your kids well, medical advice, how to keep your kids healthy, fresh air, which was a much bigger issue early in the century. We don't have any fresh air anymore or something because it's no longer there. Intellectual stimulation or social and emotional development. And if you look at the first half of the century, almost all the advice that experts gave to parents of young children was about nutrition and medicine and to some extent fresh air. Now, why? Well, infant mortality was non-trivial at the first third of the 20th century. Lots of kids died, and so medical advice was actually sort of right on target. But there was also a kind of psychological view that you didn't want to overstimulate kids, that you should just kind of keep them quiet. She cites an article that says children should sleep 22 hours a day. So there was a different medical, psychological, and sort of cultural view of what parents should be doing. Well, starting in sort of the 50s and 60s and 70s, you get much more focus in these articles on cognitive stimulation, intellectual stimulation, and social-emotional development. And so if you think about these articles as sort of a way to read the sort of zeitgeist of the 20th century and sort of how parents are thinking about their role as parents, there's a real shift to a focus on kids' brains from a focus on kids' bodies, right? And if that's more common, a shift more common among higher income or better educated moms, then that might help explain this. Or B, if it's a shift that takes money to act on, it might be all well and good to think you're supposed to spend time on the cognitive stimulation of your kid. But if you're a single mom and you're working 2 jobs, you just don't have the time and the space maybe to do it as much as if you're a 2-parent family in the 1960s where mom is staying at home and dad is off drinking martinis or something. So it may either be, or both probably, that this shift is more reflected in higher income families, higher educated families, but also that it might take some money to sort of act on these differences, and so families with more money then can act on them more. So another thing that's changed is that families with higher incomes increasingly live in neighborhoods with lots of other families with high incomes, and low-income families live in neighborhoods with low-income families. Kendra Bischoff and I did this study where we looked at the amount of income segregation in the US over the last 40 years. And this sort of simple way of describing it is we sort of say how many families live in neighborhoods where the median income is 150% higher than in their metropolitan area. How many live in neighborhoods where the median income is 2/3 or less lower than it? And we have these different categories. And you can see over time that a lot more families live in neighborhoods that are a lot poorer than their metropolitan area average or a lot richer. And far fewer families live in these sort of mixed income, middle income families. So there's this increasing sort of polarization where if you have money, not only do you have more money than you used to, but you're increasingly likely to live in neighborhoods with lots of other families that have more money than your neighbors would have had 40 years ago. And so if you think that neighborhoods matter, either through sort of peer effects or role modeling effects, or because there's better schools or better childcare or other sort of social institutions, then you should worry a lot about this increasing income segregation, because it means all the resources that high-income families have are increasingly concentrated in sort of their own little neighborhood rather than being diffused throughout a larger metropolitan space. And if that then affects school segregation and segregation of things like childcare and all that, then that could play a role too. So all of these are sort of stories that suggest ways in which income might be becoming more important. Not just that the rich have more income, but that income might matter differently than it used to. Another story is one that Sarah McClanahan tells. Sarah's a sociologist at Princeton, and she has looked at the demography of the American family over the last 40 or 50 years. And she says that increasingly, American children grow up in one of two kinds of very polarized families. One is the sort of two-parent family where both parents have a high level of education. Either both parents are employed or the mom stays at home. The mom didn't have her first child until she was well into her 20s and sort of in a more stable place in her life. And so there's that sort of one type of family. Or you have the single-parent family where the mom had her first child when she was in her teens. She has a relatively low level of education. She's unemployed or underemployed and therefore has a relatively low income. And that families have gotten more and more polarized. There's fewer and fewer families that don't fit one of those two models. There's fewer families that are two-parent families that are lower income, for example. And so income, the family income, has gotten increasingly correlated with the family structure. So if you have high income now, it's not just that you have high income, but you also are much more likely to have two well-educated parents, and dad is employed and mom is either employed or staying home. And if you have low income, it doesn't just mean you have low income, but you have a less educated mom who's underemployed or unemployed and had you relatively young and therefore has a lot of stress in her life. And so this polarization of families means that income travels increasingly with these other sort of family features. And income is more strongly associated with parents' education and cognitive skill than it used to be because the economy has changed. It used to be in the 50s and 60s that you could get a high school diploma and go work in a very high-paying union job in manufacturing and make a solid middle-class income even though you didn't have a high level of education. That's increasingly not possible. So now when people have a high income, it also means they tend to have a high level of education. And so it might not be that income matters more. It might be that income comes more often with high levels of parental education. There's also increased assortative mating. If you don't know what that is, you're probably doing it. Even if you know what it is, you're probably doing it. Assortative mating is the tendency of people to marry people of their same sort of social or educational level. And so it's increasingly common that people will marry or partner with people who have the same level of education. So now you don't have families where dad has a college degree and mom has a high school degree nearly as often as you used to. If dad has a college degree, then mom tends to also. And so along with the money that comes from that, you have two highly educated parents instead of one that you might have had more often. So all of these are sort of stories that suggest not only do the high-income families have more money, but they have more of a lot of the other sort of family resources that travel with money because those things are increasingly correlated with how much money the family has. And so you might think that this rising gap between high and low income families isn't just because of dollars they have necessarily, but because all the stuff that comes with dollars or that people are doing with their dollars differently than they used to. So how much time do we have? I don't even know. Where are we? Okay, we're perfect then. All right. So just to sort of summarize the trend and then make some sort of larger comments here to conclude. the big story here is that this income achievement gap, the test score gap between high and low income kids, has grown sharply in recent decades. I should say there's some really interesting work by Robert Putnam at Harvard. You might know Bob Putnam's work. He wrote the book Bowling Alone and a newer book called American Grace. He's a political scientist who's sort of focused on civic engagement and social capital and things. And he's been doing some parallel work to this, where instead of looking at how the achievement gap between high and low income has changed over time, he's been putting together data from a lot of studies looking at how the civic engagement gap between young people from high and low income families has changed over time. So to what extent are young people engaged in clubs and sports teams? Are they leaders of clubs or presidents of their student council, or a whole bunch of sort of activities like that, these sort of pro-social behaviors that aren't necessarily reflected in test scores? And he finds exactly parallel stories. Starting sometime around the mid-1970s, the gap in civic engagement and sort of pro-social behavior between high and low income kids has widened as well. And so not only should you be worried about what I told you, but you should also worry about what Bob Putnam is telling us, that this has happened not just in test scores, but in a broader set of outcomes. And I think the fact that they've grown most rapidly at the top is something we really need to think a lot about, because it suggests a different set of policy solutions maybe than if it were growing at the bottom. And I think the other big thing to keep in mind is how big the gaps are when kids enter kindergarten. And so if we're going to think about solutions, we're going to need to think about what to do in early childhood to prevent those gaps, because it's going to be easier to prevent them than it is going to be to remedy them after they've already developed. Now, I don't think inequality alone. So you might say, well, inequality has been going up. It's a big problem. And we should just redistribute income, and that will solve this problem. I think we should have a much more redistributive system for a lot of reasons. There's a lot of evidence, a new study that the IMF just put out, that suggests income inequality is bad for economic growth. I mean, there's a whole bunch of reasons, apart from basic fairness, that you might worry about rising income inequality. But I suspect that just shrinking income inequality is not going to be sufficient to shrink the income achievement gap. That we're going to need to do more than that, because it's not just about more money. It's about money being more important than it used to be. And so here's my best shot at kind of the big story about how to think about why this has happened. So I think for young workers, the returns to a college degree doubled from 80 to 2000. That is, getting a college degree turned out to be much more important in the labor market in the 2000s than it was in the 1970s. And this wasn't lost on parents, because they were all in the labor market and they could tell how important a college degree was coming. And so the fact that education and educational success and getting into college and completing college gets more and more important makes parents change their behavior and think differently about what they should be doing with their children. And so it changes parental behavior in all the ways I talked about, I think, but it also changes how we think about what schools are supposed to be. We increasingly focus our educational policy on test scores and academic success, because we're worried about this sort of future economy. And what all this does, I think, is it leads to increased competition for educational advantage. If you think of education as what sociologists call a positional good, that it doesn't just matter how much education you have, it matters where you are in the rank. So that as everyone starts to get a high school diploma is not good enough anymore. Now you need a college degree. As everyone starts to get a college degree, pretty soon everyone's going to need a master's degree, and so on. So that it matters where you rank, not just how much you have. And if that's true, that makes for lots of competition, because you can't just be satisfied knowing, hey, my kid will get into college. They're doing pretty well in school. No, my kid needs to get into a really good college and do really well in order to sort of rise to the top of this. And so this kind of competition for your children's educational success, because their educational success seems to be so tied to their economic success, and because we seem to think economic success is the only kind of success that really matters anymore, we might think about other kinds of success, but most of the discourse is about that. Then income matters much more, because income helps you in that competition. And so the more competitive it gets, the higher the stakes get, the more income matters because you can buy lots of things that are beneficial in that competition. Not to mention all the other things that are coming along with income along the way. But I think this is part of how to understand the sort of changes in parenting behavior, the changes in parenting investment, and the changing in the sort of returns to income that we see in the data. So there's this kind of spiraling competition where education matters more, and so those with more money invest more and more of that, and that sort of leads to the top pulling away because they have so much more money than they used to. So not only do they use their money more, but they have a lot more of it to use, and so you get this stretching out of the high end of the income of the achievement distribution. And the big problem here, I think, is that this makes the American dream really difficult. The American dream is the idea that no matter how humble your origins, you can climb the socioeconomic ladder to a position of great success in American society. But if it's true that those who do well in school increasingly get rich, and that those who are rich increasingly have children who do the best in school, you end up in this feedback cycle where social mobility gets increasingly impossible. That the people at the top maintain their position at the top, and people at the bottom maintain their position at the bottom. And so there's the problem here, I mean, I think the really big worry is that it calls into question the whole sort of social mobility premise of American society. And I think that's a great thing about America, that we ought to worry a lot about it being tarnished. And while I think schools might help, solve this problem, I don't think you can lay the blame for this on schools. None of the data seems to suggest that these gaps arise during the school years or get wider during the school years. And so I think we can think about schoolings as part of a broad solution, but not the fundamental cause, and certainly probably not the fundamental solution, though obviously a good place to start. So what should we do? So here's my really vague policy implications. So reduce economic inequality, item 1. Okay, once we're done with that, move on. So I think, if I had a bunch of money to invest in American society, this is where I would put it. Invest in early childhood for a whole bunch of reasons, not just for equity reasons, but also because, all the neuroscience suggests that's when the brain is most plastic. The brain is still malleable as kids age, but you can make big developmental changes in early childhood. It's much more cost effective. The long-term studies show that society gains lots more benefits than it costs to make these kind of early childhood benefits. Now, there's a lot of debate lately about should they be means-tested programs, that is, should you only make state-provided early childhood programs and child care available to low-income families, or should you make them universal? Universal are more sort of politically palatable, but probably less cost-effective because you're just replacing money that high-income families were spending already on their kids. But however you do it, and I'll leave that to you guys to figure out because you're near Washington. I think investment in early childhood is probably the best place to put your money in terms of thinking about both equity and just improvement in educational outcomes. And then I think programs that support low-income families. It's very hard for low-income families to act on their desire to improve their kids' educational success, given all the sort of stress and anxiety and worries that come along with being low income in American society. If you're working a couple jobs and worried how you're going to pay the rent and keep a roof over your kid's head and get healthy meals on the table, it's really hard to spend a few hours reading Goodnight Moon every night and doing all the sort of cognitively stimulating things that middle-class parents take for granted as what you do as a parent. I don't think it's for lack of desire to see your kids do well. I think it's often for lack of time and energy and focus. And so things that help families, like the Nurse Family Partnership, which is a program that has been shown to be quite effective, where nurses visit the homes of first-time low-income moms and help them teach them some parenting skills, both medical and nutrition advice, but also sort of parenting skills. And they've done a bunch of studies of this starting in the 1980s, and they follow the kids who get this nurse-family partnership, and they do much better on all sorts of outcomes long-term and these are randomized trials, so they're nice studies. And so I think programs like that help support, that help families be better at what they want to be, which is good families, good parents, are probably a good place to invest money too. And then I think we could do more in education to really figure out how to not just target resources to low-income schools, but also to learn more about how to teach in low-income settings and teach low-income kids more effectively. That is, I don't think it's enough just to say, well, we need to invest more in it if we don't know what's really effective. So I think we need to do more work in sort of targeted educational strategies that are going to help kids from less advantaged backgrounds. You know, that's not a very specific set of policy recommendations, but you know, that's not my greatest strength. I'm really good at telling you what the problem is, I think. So, yeah, Freeman?
Let's give him a hand first of all. Comment about a factor that we didn't talk about. This is a campus that would be considered a highly selective public place. We're in the top quarter. You look at UCal campus.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at test scores and grades from high school and other places, you'd say it's a fairly middle-class campus. But a lot of people don't go first generation college. The factor that makes the difference by race, by every race, is that large numbers of the students are first generation American. If you look at the gap, just talk about blacks.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue that if you go to places where all of the blacks have been in this country for generations, you may be back to the kind of wide gap you'd seen before. If you go to places like Prince George's County, where you have a lot of kids from the Caribbean, from Nigeria, places like that, and you look at their performance, it raises it for other people.
Right.
And so, for me, whether we're talking about blacks, whites, Asians, Hispanics, whatever group, low income is a major part of the issue, but we see so many people who may be from low-income families, but because of that hunger for the knowledge, they do far better than you would expect based on income level or education level because of those values there. And I'm saying, it seems to me there's something there that could be instructive to all of us as we think about what we can do to help kids who've been here for generations.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that it's hard for me to imagine that all kids aren't born with some innate hunger. And I think, so the question is, why does it disappear for some kids, or kids in some communities and not others? And I think it's one of the best arguments for greater sort of social integration, not just by race, but also by income or generational status. Because if you grow up in a community where people have sort of been beaten down by being sort of kept out of the American dream for a long time, and there aren't a lot of adults in your community who've had lots of educational success, it's hard to see a role model there. It's hard for anyone to sort of tell you, do well. After I was in college, I went and I taught high school on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, which at the time was the poorest county in the United States. It's now the second poorest county in the United States, so some progress. But I taught at this school run by the Jesuits, which was a free but private school, and there were a lot of kids who were really smart, and I would say to them, work hard and you do well and you're going to go to college, and I would tell them the story that I was told, that everyone I grew up with sort of was told, and I realized that as I looked around, it didn't really, I had no credibility. There was 85% unemployment. Almost nobody had completed a college degree. Lots of people had done some college, community college, gone away to college and come back. But if you did, there was no jobs. And so it was really hard to convince somebody that there was a real payoff to this investment when they looked around them and there was absolutely no evidence. And there was generations of no evidence of that. And so I think you've got to be able to grow up in a place where you can look around and see some possibility that the rungs of the ladder can't be so far apart that it's demoralizing, right?
I agree.
There's got to be a ladder, right?
You're going to what's happening to those who come to this country and somehow start off low income and things of racial nature. To separate out the issues, the challenges, the strategies have to be
Right, right. Yeah. Do we have time for other questions? What do we got? Okay. Other questions?